Hi there, everyone. Welcome back to the Satyrian Technical Series, where we break down SAP Security and Authorization Administration into short, practical how-to videos. Each episode focuses on an SAP tool, function, or concept, helping you understand what it does, when to use it, and how to apply it in practice. In this episode, we'll be covering the SAP User Authorisation Trace, the STUSERTRACE transaction code. The STUSERTRACE is a more recent SAP Trace development and it comes of great use to us as authorization and security consultants when we are embarking on anything from daily authorization management clients to complete role redesign, extremely technical engagements at any sort of client that we engage with. And what the tool does essentially is basically read authorization or record SAP authorization checks against users. But the difference, I guess, to your traditional SAP tracing methods is that this is not a temporary or a short-term trace that is activated to kind of read events that are happening in a short time frame or short time window. This is a trace that is intended as a long-term SAP trace. And kind of meant to just run in the background and record these authority checks with, of course, the kind of mitigation on the trace functionality to prevent the records from growing and kind of ending up with a lot of system performance issues in that it records unique authority checks from users in the system, effectively recording an authority check that has occurred once and not recording the same check twice from any given user to prevent those trace records from growing and kind of just growing exponentially over time. So that is the topic of today's session. I'm going to just open and share my screen and we can tuck into some use cases and examples using the STUSERTRACE. All right, first things first is that there is some prep work involved in activating the STUSERTRACE, and that involves system parameters. So when we talk about the STUSERTRACE and system parameters, there is basically a system parameter that needs to be activated before the trace can be used. That parameter is both a static and a dynamic parameter. So maintenance of the parameter in the dynamic profile of the system. So basically being able to set a parameter in the live environment, the parameter will take effect immediately, whereas your static profile parameters will only take effect after the next server restart. We're both able to set the parameter, which I'm putting on screen now, your auth user trace parameter in the dynamic profile of the system. We'll display that parameter and its details. We'll see here that the kernel default is off so the default is off or N for not active, whereas we want a Y value to actually just apply a system-wide activation of the trace. There's no filters that are required to activate the trace. However, just as a precaution, because this trace is capable of recording very wide amounts and large amounts of data. There is, of course, the mitigation of only recording authorization checks once. That doesn't mean that there are not enough unique authority checks in the environment to cause a detrimental system performance impact. So what we usually recommend is that the trace is active with a value of F, which means the trace can only be activated once a filter has been applied. There are then certain filters that we can apply, which we'll see shortly, such as excluding of certain users or excluding of certain authorization objects that are maybe historically known to consume a lot of the or write a lot of records to the trace, but maybe unnecessary for the intention of what we're using the trace for. So we'll set it to a value of F, make sure we exclude those authority objects so that the trace can grow for 99% of the system, but not grow to extremely large amounts on the account of one authority object, authorization object, or maybe a handful of problem users that we'd like to exclude, such as like system users that are running a lot of background jobs, contributing large amounts of data to the trace. So this is where we'll set it in the dynamic profile or transaction RZ10, your basis, RZ11, your basis team will typically be responsible for that. You then will also need to set the parameter in RZ10 as well, or the static profile of the system, meaning that once the next server restart occurs in our system, the parameter change will take effect permanently, or until it is, of course, changed again. So dynamic parameters, as we should know, is taking effect immediately, but those are reset to the defaults after the next server restart. However, the static profile will apply the change to the parameter only after the next server restart, but that change then remains in effect and even after the following server restarts after that change is made. So applying it in the dynamic profile to activate the trace immediately now without having to wait for the next restart, but also applying it in the static profile of the system so that after the next server restart, we don't have to reactivate it in a dynamic profile. We can just kind of continue using the trace, knowing that it will remain active through server restarts. All right. Now I'm going to go to our transaction itself because we now understand how to activate the trace. So within our demo environment over here, what we're showing is, or the landing screen of STUSERTRACE transaction, we're showing the filter criteria. So we can see that the filter is active. That's based on the parameter setting. So we have a parameter setting of Y, meaning that the trace is active or can be active without any filters being set. Right, when we have a value of F, it means that the trace will be active, but only once a filter has been applied down here. We're seeing that the last change, so that the trace was active, the date and time when it was last had a change applied, and then we've got the filters that have been applied to the trace settings over here. Right, first things first is that we can see that the trace is recording for all users. So that's an include pattern operator over here. And obviously for star, we are including all users in the system. But we have at Centurion identified certain authorization objects that consume a lot of records in the trace. That we typically recommend clients to exclude from the trace filter to just prevent or just mitigate the possibility of the trace having a negative impact on system performance by growing the underlying database table to millions and millions of records, and that then taking up a lot of disk space on the runtime performance of our end users. So these objects are typically authorization objects that don't have unique fields. So an example that I'm quite familiar with is our K order object. So this authorization object includes a field for order numbers. Order numbers are, of course, changing from each transaction to every transaction. Those order numbers are constantly changing. They're never static or the same. So every time a user is executing a SAP application that calls on this authority object and there's a new order number in scope, which of course happens a lot, that will then write new entries to the table. That authorization object has no relevance to SAP licensing in your S/4HANA systems, and also is typically not sensitive. So we are usually happy to exclude the recording of authority checks in that author object to kind of, we can record the rest of the system, but just not this. So it's one exclusion for the benefit of analyzing the rest of the system. And the same goes for some other objects that we're seeing here as well. All right. In our last episode where we covered the STAUTHTRACE, we made use of a tech series user to kind of showcase how authority checks are logged and analyzed using the STAUTHTRACE. I'd recommend you take a look at that episode if you haven't already. But in essence, we executed some activities within SUSE1 for user maintenance and as well as table display using SE60N to display how certain authority checks are shown as passed and failed and how we can troubleshoot that using the STAUTHTRACE. those records will also write to the STUSERTRACE. So our STAUTHTRACE recording a short time frame of checks, STUSERTRACE, a long-term trace that if it is active for a year, you can pull authority checks results against the user from a year back. And we'll get into those details shortly. But as far as our filters or our restrictions or evaluation goes, we can filter for, of course, a specific user, for a specific type of application, whether that is a transaction, a Webden Pro application, a Fiori OData service, RFC function module, etc. We can also specify certain authorization objects. The result of the check, was it failed? Was it passed? Is there no authorization in the user model? So the user buffer. Are we looking to work with a specific CDS entity? All right, and the created from and to. So do we have a certain time frame in which we want to analyze this for? I don't have anything of that nature at the moment. I just want to see my results for my text series user. So evaluating the trace results, I'm going to get all of the unique authorization checks or authority checks performed by this user while they have been processing their tasks. We'll see here, as I mentioned, there were some activities performed with this user using SE16N and SU01. We can see a few failed authority checks here, as well as those that were passed. All right, we can see whether or not there was any CDS entity or access filtering applied as a result of this authorization check, as well as then the details of the check itself. So what was the authorization object checked? What's the field names? What are the values that were required by the authority check of the program the user was executing? And then later on, we see the date and time of such executions. So what I want to draw attention to for this example is just SU01, where our user, or maybe let's use SE16N as the example here. So we had a check in SE16N by our text series user for object S_TABU_NAM to take a look at table AGR users or display that table. We see the date and time that it was executed being the 14th of May. And at that time, if I go to my text series user itself, all right, and I execute SE16N, we see I'm in text series. I'm going to execute my AGR users table. All right, let's just, that's cool. I've got my results here. Basically what that is going to do is in the short-term trace, like STAUTHTRACE, it's going to write a new entry there saying that the user has executed this. And let's, for the sake of this demonstration, just execute a new table that hasn't been executed yet. Right. Put that in there as well and get some results. In our STUSERTRACE, I'm going to execute or evaluate my results again for my test user. I'm going to go straight to my AGR users check that we made to show that the trace still has only one record for this authority check. We can see the timestamp is when it was first executed, not when it was last executed. So essentially, SAP will write that record to the trace. First time a user executes something, the second time a user or the following times the user executes the same action, it's not going to add an additional record to the trace. And that's the mitigation that allows this to be a long-term trace, is that it will only log a unique authority check once and not again. We can then see, for example, our execution that we did following that of table USR02. That has, of course, then created a record at the current date and timestamp or the first time it was executed. And that has now written an additional record to our results that we can use to analyze. All right. In the same way as our STAUTHTRACE goes, we still have the same functionalities here. For example, to take a look at a specific authorization check and analyze the user buffer. So I'm selecting a failed check for SUser group in SU01, where we tried to make a change to a user and failed on activity 02. We have here then the options to see what are the existing authorizations in the user buffer for that authority object. It's quite useful for our auth administrators when we are applying or providing a support function. All right. And I guess that's kind of where I want to leave it for this user. I also want to then kind of give us a few other examples. So if I don't necessarily want to have a user focus, I can also take it to a type of application focus. So if I want to look at all the authority checks that were executed by users within the system for a specific application. So for example, a transaction code, let me use SU01 for example here. I now get the full history of all of the authority checks made by all users in the system against SU01. Again, so we will see duplicates in this result where we now do see all the users that have executed it and get the duplicates. However, basically, these are all the auth checks that have been made by all our users against a specific application. We can then take the results of this and basically format perhaps something like authorization defaults to say these are the defaults I want in my transaction or SU24 for SU01 because these are the values that are executed by my users in the system. I think the benefit of this is being able to selectively choose what users are contributing these values. So if I want to form an authorization default profile for transaction SU01, but I only want the values that have been contributed by a consultant and not the developers, all I need to do is maybe, even if I export this to Excel or whatever kind of data processing I'm using, or perhaps just in SAP, I just want to be able to exclude, not include my values of all users that are developers. I can then obviously analyze the results of all authority checks contributed to this transaction by non-developer users. Quite a useful case, for example, if you're analyzing productive data, you want to analyze all authority checks made to business as usual applications or applications in a business as usual context. I might want to exclude my support users or firefighter users or developers from that list of authority checks because chances are a lot of those authority checks made by those users were done in a support or development or firefighter capacity, and I don't want those forming part of my business as usual roles. So I hope that makes sense to administrators viewing our session today, but we typically find this information quite useful in our consulting engagements. As for that, I am going to leave the STUSERTRACE example and use cases there for today. Thank you very much for joining us in today's session, and we hope to see you in the next one. Be sure to check out the rest of the technical series videos on the Sapterian YouTube channel, and hopefully you find some benefit in any of them. But thank you and goodbye.